Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods for a creepy collection of camping stories. The suggestion was courtesy of Kermit. A very happy birthday to you. If you'd like a birthday message at the start of the video and to be able to pick a topic, find the info in Patreon. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. After college, I moved to Southeast Washington to work. The Blue Mountains were practically in my backyard, and as an avid hunter, I was eager to explore the land before the next season. I've always had a knack for scouting game, and I knew that if I wanted to get away from the weekend warriors and casual hunters, I'd have to go deep, far beyond the easy access spots near public roads. The more remote, the better. Being outdoors wasn't new to me. I grew up on a farm and ranch in Montana, where I spent most of my life outside, tending to livestock and learning the land. I started cornering animals when I was a kid, fooling coyotes into thinking I was a dying jackrabbit by the time I was 10. I've mimicked everything from rodents to bull elk, and I'm not saying this to brag, I'm just laying the groundwork. I know my animal calls. I know their cadence, their rhythm, and I can tell the difference between a bird and a mammal just by the texture of the sound. But what I heard that night was neither. One late afternoon, I set out into the blues. I got a later start than usual, but I wasn't too worried. Most animal activity happens around dusk and dawn. I only needed a few miles between me and the nearest road. I climbed up a ridge and found a small, relatively flat spot with a good view of the surrounding area, which was perfect for spotting game. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I'd only seen a few whitetails, and I decided to keep a dry camp that night. No fire, just a quiet, bivvy sack, and an early start in the morning. I was dead tired, but couldn't shake the uneasiness. The mountains felt different at night, too still. And then around 1 a.m. I woke up in agony. A searing, pulsing headache tore through my skull. It came in waves, a surge of pain, a brief reprieve, then another wave crashing down. I was meticulous about staying hydrated on hikes, so I knew it wasn't dehydration. Lying in my bivvy, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ride it out, when I noticed something else. A faint sound, a low, hollow noise echoing down the mountainside above me. I froze, my headache forgotten. It wasn't an animal call, but it was big. I could tell by the resonance. A large mammal for sure, but the pattern, it was too loud and repetitive and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was some unfamiliar Washington bird, no doubt something I hadn't encountered growing up in Montana. But even as I fed myself the lie, my gut screamed otherwise. The longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. The call wasn't moving. It was staying in the same spot, repeating and echoing across the mountainside. And it was too close. By 2 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. The pain in my head was unbearable, and the sound was driving me insane. I made a judgment call, pull camp and get the hell out. The way I'd hiked in was rough and direct, but I remembered a gated road just above my camp. It circled back to the main road where my truck was parked. It was a longer route, but easier to navigate in the dark, and it would take me directly towards the source of the sound. I had no other option. I had to take that road. And the call followed me. I could hear it stalking me, shadowing me, always maybe 200 to 300 yards up the mountainside, keeping pace, and no matter how fast I walked, it always stayed there matching my speed. Every snapping of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline surging through my veins. The call never wavered, it always stayed there, just out of sight. I could feel it now. Eyes watching, hunting. I kept my gun close, finger brushing the trigger, But what terrified me the most was that I couldn't see it. Whatever it was staying out of sight on purpose, and that's what scared me more than anything. My headache pounded harder as I followed the road, and my breathing became erratic. I was struggling to get air. My vision blurred, my balance was off. Surely it was altitude sickness. But something really wasn't right. I stumbled through the darkness, the sound above me growing fainter as I descended, and the moment I dropped below the tree line, something happened. The headache stopped. Instantly. As if whatever had been gripping me had finally let go. But the feeling of being watched never left. I made it back to my truck just before dawn, drained and shaken, my body weak, but my mind racing. When I got home, I was still rattled. I couldn't let it go. I spent hours searching online, trying to match the sound I'd heard. I was looking for bird calls, anything that could explain it, but nothing matched. Then, almost by accident, I typed in Bigfoot call. And there it was, the exact same sound. My blood went cold as I listened to the recording. I could feel the same dread I'd felt in the mountains that night. But here's the thing. I don't believe in Bigfoot. Never have. And yet I know what I heard. And I've never heard it again. Even on return trips to the same area. I went back once, walked right through the thick, tangled north slope where the sound had originated from. But there was nothing. It was gone. Or maybe it was watching. Since that night, I've never hunted that deep in the mountains alone. Because whatever was up there that night wasn't an animal and it wasn't human. But I knew it was there, and it was following me. Waiting. And I think it didn't plan on letting me leave. I live in a rural town surrounded by endless mountains and dense forest, so camping was almost a weekly event, even in winter. The woods felt like a second home to me, but there's one night that shattered that comfort forever. It happened when my friend and I broke off from our usual group of 16 to 19-year-olds. We wanted a better fishing spot about a mile away, near a secluded stream where the trout practically begged to be caught. Since we only had one tent for the group, we built a lean-to against a large boulder in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The spot was perfect, quiet, and isolated. Maybe too isolated. Night fell fast. The fire cracked low as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp moss. My friend had already dozed off, curled up in his sleeping bag beside the glowing embers, but I couldn't sleep. I felt off. I threw another log on the fire and scanned the tree line, trying to calm my nerves. The flames sparked and hissed, sending flickers of light out into the darkness. And that's when I saw him. A man. Standing at the edge of the clearing about 80 yards away, perfectly still. The full moon illuminated him, casting a pale glow on his motionless form, which I couldn't make out his face. It was just a silhouette, but he was definitely watching us. My blood turned cold. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with all kinds of explanations. A hiker? A hunter? But it was too late for that, and he wasn't moving. He was simply observing us. I didn't want to wake my friend and freak him out, so I kept an eye on the figure while I fed the fire. The man, as quickly as he had appeared, then turned away and walked silently back into the woods. I told myself it was just nothing, a guy passing through. But sleep never came. I lay there listening to the crackle of the fire and the rustling of leaves as it carried on the wind. Then I heard a soft footstep. My heart pounded in my ears. This time there was another one that was closer. I nudged my friend awake, and he groaned and rubbed his eyes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He He was still half asleep, but the look in my eyes must have registered because he then sat up. And another crunch. Closer this time. The sound circled the clearing, almost as if it were deliberate. We grabbed our flashlights and pointed them towards the noise, but the beams sliced through empty darkness. "Maybe a deer," my friend mumbled, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We tried to go back to sleep, but the sounds kept growing ever closer, and then a whisper of fabric brushing up against the branches. Something was definitely out there. Sometime after midnight I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound that made my blood freeze. A zipper. Our tent zipper. I bolted upright and my friend did the same, his eyes wide with terror. The sound wasn't the zipper at all. It was a slice. That's when we saw a blade slicing through the fabric. My hand found his chest, squeezed him, and as he looked over I shouted, "Run!" We didn't have time to think. I grabbed my knife and shoved the tent flap open. My friend was right behind me, and we bolted into the woods barefoot, branches tearing at our skin as we tumbled through the darkness. "Don't stop," my voice barely above a whisper, and behind us we heard the footsteps, heavy and fast. The guy was following us. My lungs burned, my legs were screaming as we crashed through the undergrowth. The forest was a labyrinth of shadow and disorienting in the moonlight. A branch cracked behind us, but we didn't look back. My feet were numb from the cold, scraped raw by rocks, twigs, and the pain barely registered. The only thing that mattered was getting away, and we ran until we swore our lungs would burst. At some point the footsteps stopped, but we didn't. We ran blindly deeper into the woods with no sense of direction. We were lost. The night stretched on forever. Every sound made us jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant echoes that could have been footsteps. We collapsed somewhere near dawn, too exhausted to keep going. My body was trembling, my feet bloodied and raw. "We need to find the road," my friend murmured, his voice barely above a whisper too. But in the vastness of the forest everything looked the same. By sheer luck, we stumbled upon a path when the sun began to rise. The warmth of the morning light was surreal after the terror of the night. But even in the daylight, the forest felt wrong. I was sure he was still there. We didn't talk much on the walk back to our group. We made it back to our tent, which had been sliced up beyond recognition. We gathered up the remnants of the fabric and our stuff, which had been thrown all over the inside of the tent and part of it smouldering on the embers of the fire. And we left, for good. We never told anyone the story. Who would believe us? But neither of us ever went camping again. Because that guy, even though it's unlikely that he was going to be back, could still be out there. For those of you who don't know, a derecho is basically a massive, fast-moving wall of wind that can rip trees straight out of the ground and topple small buildings. Imagine a freight train of wind roaring through the forest, tearing everything apart in its path. It might not sound that bad if you're sitting in your living room, but when you're deep in the woods surrounded by towering trees that could come crashing down at any second, it's absolutely terrifying. But surprisingly, the storm wasn't even the scariest part of that night. I had set my tent up inside a single-walled pavilion, a structure with a cement slab foundation and a roof but no real walls. I figured it would give me a little extra protection from flying debris and falling branches. I was wrong. Unbeknownst to me, I wasn't the only one seeking shelter from the storm. As the wind howled through the forest, bending trees and sending leaves flying like shrapnel, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me, But then I felt a very heavy presence, and a repeated tapping sound. Claws clicking against the cement just outside my tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a black bear. And not just any black bear. This one was pissed off and panicked. I've had bears outside my tent before. Usually you can scare them off with enough noise, some guttural screams, a few loud claps, maybe some strong language. But this one wasn't going anywhere. The storm had riled it up, and now it was trapped in the same pavilion as me, circling the tent with a mixture of fear and aggression. I could hear it pacing back and forth, huffing and puffing, trying to figure out what to do. Every few seconds it would leave the pavilion, only to return moments later, each time more agitated and confused. The tapping persisted. It was running in circles around me. I could hear its claws clicking rhythmically on the cement with each stride, getting closer, then further, then closer again. The sound was maddening, and with the wind outside howling like a banshee, and the trees cracking and falling in the distance, I felt completely and utterly trapped. I didn't dare move. I only sat there, heart pounding so hard I was sure the bear could hear it. The only comfort was the hunting knife I kept in my pack. Slowly, with hands shaking, I pulled it out and duct-taped it to my hand. I wasn't taking any chances. If that bear decided to come through the thin nylon of my tent, I wasn't going down without a fight. Minutes stretched into hours. I lost track of time as I sat there gripping that knife with my sweaty, duct-taped hand, waiting, listening. Eventually, mercifully, the storm began to die down. The wind eased and the bear finally wandered off, probably as exhausted and disoriented as I was. But I didn't move, not until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally stepped out the tent, I saw the tracks circling the pavilion, deep gouges left by claws that had been too close for comfort. That night was, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and to this day it's the only time I've ever encountered a black bear that I couldn't scare away. Usually they're all just a bunch of cowards, but this one wasn't backing down, and in that moment I wasn't sure if I was even going to make it out alive. I was around 12 at the time in 1998, and me and my friends decided to go for a hike in our rural area of Nova Scotia, Canada. We packed some lunches and set off up a steep hill in the woods. We were all subdivision kids, more used to playing in each other's yard or in the narrow strips of trees between houses, so this was a big adventure for us. There were around 8 of us, ranging from ages 8 to 12, and we felt like explorers venturing into unknown territory. About a half hour into the hike, we stumbled onto something unexpected. A narrow path branched off from the trail, looking like it had been carved out by ATV or dirt bikes. Curious, we followed it, and after a few minutes we found something that stopped us in our tracks. In the middle of the woods was a perfectly set-up campsite. Someone had built makeshift beds out of fresh brush, neatly arranged in rows. There was a fire pit with wood stacked beside it ready to be lit. The place looked like something out of a survival guide. It was almost too perfect. We figured it had to be some kind of Boy Scout training ground. We sat down, ate our snacks, and admired the setup. We were laughing and joking and coming up with silly names for the spot. We thought we'd found our new hangout, our secret hideaway in the woods. As the afternoon wore on, the others decided they were ready to head home, but I wasn't. I told them I wanted to stick around and explore a little more. They tried to convince me I had to go with them, but I was stubborn. I said I'd leave soon, I just wanted a little more time. After they left, I laid down on one of the brush beds, looking up at the sky. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. I felt so at peace, so proud to have found something so cool that it felt like ours. And then I heard a branch snap. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. Nothing. Just the forest, silent and still. I scanned the trees, trying to calm myself. But that's when I saw it. Far off, almost bending into the shadows, something was hanging from a tree. I squinted, trying to make it out. At first, I thought it was just a weird-shaped branch, or maybe some old hunting equipment. But as I stared, a sick feeling crept into my stomach. It was too large, too human. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was 5'9" and husky, bigger than a lot of things out there. Whatever it was, I could handle it, so like an idiot, I got up and walked towards it. As I got closer, my legs grew weaker with each step. I was maybe 80 feet away when I started laughing nervously, my brain desperately trying to convince me it was all in my head. But the closer I got, the harder it was to deny. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't gear. It was a body. I froze. My mind was screaming at me to run, but for some reason I kept moving forwards, heart pounding in my ears. And when I got close enough to really see it, that's when I lost it. The face. I will never ever forget that face. It looked rotten, decayed. The skin was shriveled and discolored, almost like the burnt, twisted corpse of Robin's father in Robin Hood, the Prince of Thieves. Its mouth was slack, and those sunken, hollow eyes seemed to stare right at me. My body finally caught up to what my mind was screaming, and I turned and ran. I didn't just run. I bolted like my life depended on it. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. I tore through the woods, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. I ran and ran until I caught up my friends. They saw me coming, wide-eyed and breathless and as pale as a ghost. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. They gathered around me, panicked, and asked me what was wrong. At first, I couldn't even speak. Tears were streaming down my face as I tried to catch my breath. Finally, between ragged breaths, I choked out the words. I saw a body. Silence fell over the group. My friends, some of them crying now, stared at me in shock. I described what I'd seen. Every grisly detail burned into my mind. We sat huddled together, far away from the campsite, too scared to move. When we finally made it home, I told my parents, who didn't believe me. It was dark by then, and there was no way in hell I was going back into those woods at night. I told them I'd show them everything in the morning. I didn't sleep a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. As soon as the sun came up, I woke up my parents and led them back to the site. I retraced my steps, pointing out to where I found the brush beds and where I had been when I saw it. I was shaking as I guided them towards the spot where the body had been. But when we got there, it was gone. No body, no trace of it, just an empty patch of forest where I knew it had been. To this day, I have no idea what happened, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that horrible, decaying face staring back at me from those trees. A friend and I were traveling through Morocco, hitchhiking and exploring along the way. One night we decided to camp on the outskirts of a town near the highway, but far enough away that we wouldn't be seen by passing cars or anyone walking along the road. It was a thick, bushy area with no obvious trails, so we figured it would be quiet and secluded. At around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of rustling. At first I thought it was some kind of animal, so I squinted into the darkness, trying to spot whatever creature might be making the noise. But after a few seconds, the rustling grew louder. I sat up, my heart starting to race as I tried to figure out what was going on. And then out of the bushes I saw him, an old man crawling towards us, his movements slow and deliberate. At first I was completely dumbfounded. This was the last place I'd expect to see someone, let alone someone crawling out of the bushes in the middle of the night. There was no reason for anyone to be there. It didn't take long for me to realize he must have been coming for us. Maybe he was after our stuff, or perhaps he had a more sinister plan. I shook my friend awake and started shouting at the man, demanding to know what he wanted. He immediately stood up, speaking quickly in a language I didn't understand, but it sounded mostly like he was apologizing. He didn't make any moves, just turned around and hurried back into the bushes, vanishing into the night. We were both too stunned and lazy to actually move, so we just went back to sleep, feeling the adrenaline still buzzing through our veins. Looking back, it was probably a really stupid decision to stay put, but at the time we were young and careless. We never figured out what his true intentions were, but it was definitely one of those moments where we realized just how vulnerable we were. A couple of years ago, a buddy of mine from Minnesota and I thought we found the perfect camping spot in southern Utah. I believe it was called Young Women's Group Campsite. It was a group site designed for around 100 campers, but we quickly noticed that both the individual and group campsites were closed for the season. That meant no fee, no water, and no trash pickup. We figured it would be quiet and secluded, which was exactly what we were looking for. We spotted a trailer, an ATV, a generator, and a pickup truck parked in the large group site parking lot, but we weren't looking to socialize or bother anyone, so I drove as far to the opposite side of the lot as I could. We established our cots and sleeping bags in the brush near the picnic tables and grills, making sure we were mostly out of sight except for my car. After a while, we decided to walk over to a sunset viewing area. That's when a truck came barreling into the parking lot. It sped down to where we were, then up to the trailer before stopping nearby. You could tell from the way the guy approached that something was off. He was angry and on a mission. The man, absolutely livid, stormed up to us and told us we needed to leave right now. I calmly asked him why, since the campground was closed and we weren't bothering anyone. He snapped and started claiming he was law enforcement and that it was his group site. I pressed him, asking to see his reservation, knowing full well that group sites were closed for the season. His response was a sputtering mess, and he doubled down, saying that it was his group site and that we were trespassing. I said we'd leave first thing in the morning. That's when he flashed a badge and a .40 caliber pistol, then threw my day pack. I carry a concealed weapon, but I didn't draw or mention it. I was focused on his face, which had now gotten way too close to comfort. My buddy, who was standing a few feet away, later told me he noticed the guy repeatedly gripping his gun, though I didn't see that part and I'm grateful for it. At that point, my buddy calmed me down, suggesting we just leave. He didn't want to stay there any longer, and truthfully neither did I. He even talked me out of returning late at night to destroy the guy's generator or flatten his tires, though trust me, I had plenty of ideas running through my head. On the drive home, we talked about the whole situation, and we both agreed this guy was either a wannabe cop or a rogue officer dealing with some serious issues. When we got back to Salt Lake City, I contacted the SLPD and confirmed that he was indeed one of their officers. After some online digging, I found out that he had been involved in a recent police shooting I'd seen on the news. At the time, I thought the shooting was justified, but after this encounter I mentioned that I needed to see more body cam footage. I suspected he might have escalated the situation with us. In the end, SLPD concluded their investigation, but they found no wrongdoing on the officer's part. In fact, he claimed we were the aggressors and we threatened him with a club. I'm 65, and my buddy was around the same age. Our weapons were lightweight walking poles. Their investigation cleared the officer, but I can't shake the feeling that the department is covering up for someone who doesn't deserve to wear the badge. I still respect the police as a whole, but I have zero respect for the dirtbags who hide behind that badge and the system that protects them. I'll never forget how close things came that day to becoming something much uglier, and I'm grateful for my buddy Greg who kept me from making a tragic mistake. As for the officer Neil, I hope you get the help you need, and SLPD open your eyes. We both walked away that day, but it easily could have gone another way. A few years ago, when I was around 16 or 17, I went camping in the far northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula with two of my friends. The weather was perfect, around 70 Fahrenheit, beautiful, sunny and calm. This was before cell phones, so I used a payphone at the ranger station to call my mum and let her know that we had arrived safely and set up camp. She warned me that the weather forecast predicted severe weather later on, but I didn't think much of it. A bit of wind wouldn't be a big deal, and tornadoes weren't something that really happened in the area. Fast forward a few hours, we returned from a hike as the sky began to darken. Suddenly the wind started picking up, and it was blowing hard in all directions. Out of nowhere, I hear a muffled voice through a megaphone as a ranger truck comes barreling down the road towards our site, warning us over loudspeaker to take cover. There was a tornado warning. We scrambled to the bathhouse along with a handful of other campers in this remote park, as the sky seemed to open up with an intensity I'd never seen. Lightning flashed, hail the size of golf balls started coming down, and the wind howled so loudly I thought the whole forest was going to tear itself apart. We huddled in the bathhouse for what felt like forever, listening as trees cracked and thudded to the ground around us, shaking the building. The thunder was so loud it made our ears ring, and the whole place felt like it was on the edge of being torn apart. After what seemed like an eternity, the storm finally subsided, and we cautiously opened the door we'd bolted shut. What we saw was pure devastation. Trees had fallen on campers, tents were tangled in the branches of trees still standing, and giant hailstones were scattered all over the place, slowly melting in the freezing temperatures that had just dropped from the 70s to the 30s in just over an hour. With the roads blocked by fallen trees, we couldn't get out, so we spent the night in the bathhouse with the other campers. The rangers had set up propane heaters vented through the shower exhaust fan holes, which provided some relief, but it was still a very long and cold night. That tornado was the first to hit the area in a century, and it wasn't until 20 years later that another one touched down in the same place. By the end of it all, I lost my tent. It was found in a tree, shredded into pieces by the wind and hail. My parents felt bad for me, so they bought me a brand new one, which I definitely wasn't expecting. Still, it remains the scariest experience of my camping career, and is something I honestly will never forget. I grew up in Wyoming, but for some reason we always seemed to go camping in Colorado. I was around 12 back then in the early 80s, so at about 2 a.m., it was dark, cold, and we were deep in the mountains. I woke up freezing. I was going to head to the car to warm up, so I dragged my sleeping bag out, climbed over my brother, and woke him up in the process. Of course, he claimed that he had to pee, but I figured that it was just his way of following me as he always did. We get out of the tent, and it's getting light, so I decided to stay up rather than head back to bed. I pointed to the light creeping over the top of the mountain and said, "The sun's coming up, so I'll just stay up." My brother, being a little Cub Scout, immediately corrected me, telling me the sun didn't rise there. Naturally, as the older sibling, I had to argue. Well, that woke our parents, and my dad snuck his head out the tent. He saw the same bright red glow over the horizon, and immediately recognized it. It was a forest fire. We scrambled into action, packing everything up as quickly as we could. We didn't even bother to unpack the tent. We just collapsed it and shoved everything into the back of our 1976 Ford Country Squire. My dad drove as fast as he dared on those narrow, winding gravel roads. He kept telling us that everything was fine and that we were ahead of the fire. But with the smoke thickening around us and the sheer drop off the side of the road, I was terrified. The lack of guardrails and the ominous feeling of the fire creeping closer made me feel like we were racing towards something we could not escape. We hadn't been driving for long when we saw a game warden truck coming from the side road, heading straight towards another campground. He flashed his lights at us and we stopped. Dad spoke to him for a moment, and the warden told us the fire was spreading quickly and that he was evacuating the campsites. He reassured my dad that we still had time to get out, but it didn't really help my nerves. The smoke was getting worse, and I didn't feel any relief until we finally made it back home. Every time I see footage of people fleeing wildfires in the West or up in Canada, I remember that experience. A little part of my brain still freaks out thinking back to how terrifying the whole experience was, especially the drive, knowing just how quickly things can go wrong and lives can be snuffed out. We went camping in the Grand Canyon. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip, just us and the beauty of nature. But that day turned into a nightmare that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. Our 3-year-old daughter was with us, happily playing at the campsite. One second she was right there, and the next she was gone, just gone. At first I thought maybe she had wandered a few steps away, but as I scanned the area she was nowhere in sight. My heart started pounding and panic set in. I called her name. Nothing. My voice grew louder, more frantic. I ran to the van, yanked open the door and shouted her name again. She wasn't there. I slammed the door shut and kept running, screaming for her, running from site to site. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Had someone taken her? Had she wandered off towards the canyon? Every terrifying possibility flooded my thoughts as I tore through the campground yelling her name over and over. Minutes felt like hours. My throat was raw from screaming, and I was losing it completely. And then my husband called out. I turned to him and saw him standing by the van. Relief flooded me so hard my legs almost gave out. But the relief was short-lived when I realized where he found her. Inside the van, the same van I had checked. She was hiding under a pile of clothes. I couldn't believe it. I had shut the door with her inside on a blistering hot day and over 100 degrees. It hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees buckled as I ran to her, pulling her out, holding her tight. I was afraid I might crush her. She was fine, but I wasn't. My mind spiraled, my hands were shaking as I held her, trying to process what had just happened. You see, a few months before, I had taught her how to open and close the van's sliding door, and she liked to play surprise hide-and-seek, and that is exactly what she'd done. I had checked the van, but in the chaos and panic, I didn't see her buried under the clothes. We cancelled the rest of our camping trip immediately. There was no way I could stay another night after that. We packed up and booked a cabin nearby, because I couldn't even think about staying outdoors anymore. I think my soul left my body that day, and I even feel sick when I think about it. What if my husband hadn't have found her though? What if we hadn't have checked? In another universe, one where he didn't open the door, I don't even want to imagine. I'm pretty sure for all parents this is their worst fear, and I lived it that day. Maybe if you don't have kids, you'll never truly understand just how your heart shatters into 1,000 tiny pieces when this panic, which is unlike any other, sets in. I was camping up near Mount Baker in Washington State at a place called Horseshoe Cove Campground. When we first arrived, we stopped by the bulletin board to check for any notices. That's when we saw it, a missing person poster. The man had been gone for a while, so we didn't think much of it. According to the poster, he had gone out on a stormy night and never returned. It also mentioned he didn't know how to swim, which felt like an ominous detail in hindsight. The next day we decided to go kayaking on Baker Lake. The water was calm and we spent a good while paddling around, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as we started to make our way back towards the shore, something felt off. A strange, sour smell hit us. It was coming from an area near the swimming zone, roped off with buoys where families and kids usually swim. At first, we assumed it was just the lake, maybe some rotting vegetation or fish. But as we got closer, the smell grew stronger, heavier. We paddled past the swimming area, heading towards the spot where we had entered the lake, and that's when we saw it. Under one of the buoys near the swimming zone, something was caught. We drifted closer, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, and then the realization hit us like a punch to the face. It was the missing man. His body had been trapped beneath the buoy, barely hidden beneath the surface. And what chilled me the most was the thought of all the kids who had been swimming just feet away, completely unaware of what was hiding just beneath the surface. Our blood ran cold. We paddled back to shore as fast as we could and alerted the police. They had been searching for him all this time and no one had ever thought to check that area close to the swimming area. The authorities came, they closed off the swimming zone, we packed up and left early. There was no way we could stay after that, but the unease didn't leave us. That night before we left, something else happened. We kept hearing strange noises around our campsite, low, rustling sound, footsteps perhaps, and then the scurrying. Rats. We could hear them moving through the underbrush, darting around our tent. But the weirdest part was it didn't sound like they were foraging. It sounded like they were following us, circling. I don't know if it was the stress from what we found in the lake, or just nerves on edge, but that whole night felt wrong. Like we weren't supposed to be there. Like something didn't want us there. I haven't been back to Horseshoe Cove since, and I don't think I ever will. I was with a group of around 8 people, and we weren't in a formal campground. We always preferred to hike deep into the wilderness as far away from people as possible. This time was no different. We were in an extremely isolated spot, somewhere deep in the Rockies, about 10,000 feet of elevation. It was around 9 or 10 p.m., pitch black and dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness that blanketed the forest. We were all sitting around the fire, pretty buzzed off whiskey by this point, when out of nowhere, a man stepped into the firelight. I can still see him in my mind. He wasn't wearing a shirt. In the freezing mountain air, where it was cold enough to see your breath, this guy was bare-chested, with dirt and grime smeared across his skin. He had a hunting rifle slung over his back, and this vacant, almost hollow expression on his face like he wasn't fully there. But what really freaked us out was how he got so close. We hadn't heard a single sound before he appeared. Nothing, no footsteps, no branches. He had crept up on us without making a sound. We all went deathly silent, staring at him. No one moved. No one spoke. He stood there looking around the camp with that empty expression, his eyes scanning all of us. Then without saying a word, he slowly backed away, melting into the darkness of the forest. That should have been it, but it wasn't. We didn't go to bed after that. None of us felt safe. We slept in shifts, keeping the fire blazing all night. And that's when we started to hear him again. Faint, almost imperceptible footsteps circled the camp. Twigs snapped just beyond the firelight. Every so often we'd catch a glimpse of movement in the darkness, like he was waiting, watching. He stayed out there all night, and by the time the first rays of sunlight hit the treetops, we packed up camp faster than we ever had before. None of us said a word until we were at a safe distance away, and as soon as we had service, I reported everything to the Park Service, but I don't know if they ever found him. That was the scariest night of my life. I've never gone back to that part of the mountain, and I don't think I ever will. For about 10 years, my family owned a campground, so avoiding the great outdoors wasn't exactly an option. Privately owned, prideful, which really meant we couldn't afford to hire anyone, so my parents, my siblings, and I did everything ourselves. We mowed, we cleaned, we unclogged toilets, you name it. But nothing, I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that summer. It was the morning of July the 5th, a nightmare for anyone tasked with cleaning up after a holiday weekend. I was 13, and my dad asked me to handle the bathhouses. "Start with the front one," he said. No big deal. I'd done it a million times. To my surprise, the front bathhouse wasn't that bad. A few stray beer cans, some toilet paper on the floor, nothing out of the ordinary after a long weekend of booze and fireworks. Then I moved on to the back one. I knew something was wrong the second I opened the door to the men's side. The smell. It slammed into me like a brick. Thick, sour, and suffocating. A rancid cocktail of defecation, vomit, and something worse. My stomach turned. Something had died in there, or so I thought. I took a cautious step inside, my shoes squelching on the grimy floor. The air was heavy, thick with moisture that clung to my skin, and that's when I saw it. A trail, brown, chunky, and wet. It started at the stalls and snaked across the floor leading towards the showers about 15 feet away. Diarrhea and vomit. My eyes followed the trail, every step worse than the last, and that's when I saw him, face down in the showers and unmoving. It was a man, covered head to toe in poo and vomit, his body limp and lifeless, tangled in the mixture of filth. I froze. Is he dead? My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was paralyzed. The smell, the sight, I couldn't process it. I felt bile rising in my throat for a terrifying moment. I thought I was about to add to the mess. But then I had to know. Was he breathing? I didn't want to get close, but I had to do something. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wooden handle of the broom that I'd been carrying, and I extended it, arm fully outstretched towards his leg, and gave a cautionary poke. Nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. One more poke. Harder this time. The man moved. He was alive. Relief washed over me for a split second before pure, unfiltered terror set in. Nope. No way I was dealing with this at 13. I had the sudden bone-chilling realization that my dad did not pay me nearly enough to deal with a situation like this. I dropped the broom and ran, sprinted out of that bathhouse like my life depended on it, because in that moment I felt like it did, going straight for my mum. Gasping, shaking, and on the verge of tears, I told her everything. She didn't even hesitate. Go get your father. I don't know what Dad said when he saw the mess. I don't know what went through his mind when he saw the man-shaped nightmare lying in the shower. All that I know is that he was the one who had to clean it up, not me. And to this day, I still can't walk into a public restroom without the smell coming back to haunt me. And if you ever ask me to go camping, hell no. Not after that. A couple of years ago, me and a group of friends, about 8 of us, were camping in Jasper. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m, and we were all a little drunk, as you do when camping in Alberta. The rangers don't care as long as you're not being a belligerent ass, so we were just hanging around the fire, shooting the breeze before heading to our tents for the night. Out of nowhere, this car comes roaring up the road and pulls right into our campsite. All of us immediately turned, confused as hell. "Yo, dude, you lost?" someone asked, when a voice from the car called out, "This is the police." We all froze, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't a cop car, just some random unmarked vehicle, and any legit cop car would flash a badge if they were approaching a group of drunk campers in the middle of the night. This guy didn't. Instead, after saying that one line, he just pulled out and drove away. We all looked at each other, confused. The whole thing felt shady as hell. The vibe shifted instantly. Gone was the easy-going, tipsy buzz of the evening, and now we were all on edge. A few minutes later, an actual park ranger's vehicle came rolling down the road. As luck would have it, they passed the same car that had just pulled that weird stunt. We flagged the ranger down as fast as we could and told him everything. What the guy said, the sketchy behavior, and how they had just driven off moments ago. The ranger's expression went serious. He said they'd been getting reports all night about stuff going missing from tents and coolers in the area. He told us he'd radio the front gate and try to track down the car. That killed the vibe for the night hard. None of us could shake the feeling that something was seriously off. We tried to laugh at first, but the unease settled over us like a heavy blanket. We ended up calling it a night, double-checking all our valuables were locked in the car before heading to our tents. Even after I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there. Hey guys, there ends the video. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you had fun and enjoyed the stories. I'll be back on Saturday with another chilling collection of stories. If you'd like your birthday shout-out and to be able to pick the video of your choice for that day, again, info in Patreon, link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen now. Their contributions are invaluable, and it would mean a hell of a lot if you joined. It's cool perks if you want it. But that's it from me. More videos on screen now. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.